Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here this morning. I'm going to give folks about a minute or so to trickle in and before we go ahead and kick off our presentation. But hope everyone's having a lovely morning so far. Well, it looks like we have a pretty good handful of folks in the room with us today. So I'll go ahead and get started. But thank you again for joining us here this morning for the Affordable Housing Electrification Training Series. My name is Rachel Diaz, and I'm a program manager at the California Housing Partnership, specifically on our Sustainable Housing Program team. And today we're going to be kicking off our fourth installment of our electrification training series. And today we're going to be chatting about how solar can help to accelerate electrification in affordable housing. And we're really happy to, again, have you all here in the room and hope you came ready to dive into all things solar. Next slide, please. As a reminder, our last training will be held next Wednesday, October 4th, and it will cover financing and funding the electrification of new and existing affordable housing. This is our fifth and final session, and it will explore a bunch of clean energy resources and available financing options for energy efficiency upgrades. So make sure to register if you're not already. We're really excited to have that be our closeout presentation next week. Next slide. And before we begin, I did just have a few general housekeeping items that I wanted to cover. So first, just wanted to note that this session is being recorded and it will be made available after the conclusion of the event. All of our trainings have been recorded and are hosted on SCAMP's website. We do have an electrification training series playlist that houses each of those trainings, so feel free to reflect back on those. I have this linked later in the presentation as well as a resource. But in addition to the recordings, we will be making the PowerPoint decks available too. So with all of this information, feel free to pass this along to colleagues who weren't able to make it to today's session or weren't able to make it to past sessions. In addition, we will be saving some time at the end of the presentation for a Q&A session. But, if there are any clarifying questions that come through, we'll either try answering those verbally or through the chat. But we will be trying to be mindful of time. We do have a lot to cover and a little bit of time, but happy to answer questions as we can. And to submit those questions, you're just going to be using that chat box at the bottom portion of your screen. Please use that chat box or the Q&A box and not the chat box. We will specifically be looking in the Q&A section when asking our panelists any questions. So if you put it in the chat, we might not see it. So if you want your question answered, please enter it in the Q&A box. And lastly, we will be sending out a post-event survey. So please make sure to take a few minutes and provide your feedback on today's session. It'll be extremely helpful for me and the rest of my team to make sure that we do get your feedback to help tailor future trainings. We definitely want to continue providing trainings and webinars on things you're actually interested in, and we won't know that without your feedback. Next slide. And I'm excited to be joined by two experts in the field here today. We have Stacy Givens, who's a program manager with the Association for Energy Affordability. And we also are joined by Emma Barker, who's an associate project manager over at Eden Housing. Both Stacy and Emma are experts in this, as I said, and have a wealth of knowledge and experience. And I can comfortably say that I think we're in good hands as we talk about solar here today. Next slide. And again, given that we do only have an hour with each other this morning, this session will cover a wide variety of topics at a high level. But if you do have ideas on, future presentation topics, including some of these things that you want to dive a little bit deeper on, please either fill out our survey or put some feedback directly in the chat. We definitely will take those considerations in mind, again, as we think about future trainings. And just in terms of our agenda for today, we'll start with some context setting on the importance of solar in meeting your organization's electrification goals. We'll also be walking through a few solar energy basics. And then we'll be taking a look at all of the great work that Emma's team over at Eden Housing is doing through a case study. And lastly, we'll walk through a few policies and planning implementation strategies as we kind of close out the webinar. And as I mentioned earlier, we will be setting some time aside to do a Q&A session to answer any questions that you might have. Next slide. And we do have one poll question here for you all today before we begin. Our question is, what is the biggest challenge in integrating solar into your developments? I'm going to go ahead and launch this really quick. We understand that, there's probably a lot of challenges or barriers that y'all face, but we are curious to just learn what, that one specific barrier that's that you're finding to be the most complicated. We're wondering if it's financing, something like staff capacity, electrical infrastructure, and maybe a lack of financing to help get those upgrades, maintenance and monitoring or other. And if you do select other, I'm seeing some comments in the chat, so feel free to explain there as well. So it looks like NEM is an issue as well. I'll just give it a few more seconds for folks to cast their vote. I'm seeing vendors as an issue. Definitely finding, qualified workforce. It can be challenging. I understand that. Awesome. It looks like we have a majority of folks who have casted their vote. So I'll go ahead and end this and share results. So it looks like most folks have some barriers or challenges when it comes to financing. That definitely makes sense, and we're hoping that some of the information covered today helps folks feel a little bit more confident in knowing that there are resources out there to help get this work done. But even more exciting, we do have a whole session dedicated to this next week. So for folks who selected financing, I hope to see you there next week during that session. And additionally, it looks like things like electrical infrastructure are also pretty big challenges as well. But thank you for casting your votes, everyone. So with that, I think we can go ahead and jump into our presentation. So I'll turn it over to our first panelist, Stacy Givens.
Thanks, Rachel. Good morning, everyone. So today we're going to start with a section on understanding the importance of solar in meeting your organization's electrification goals. Next slide, please. The one thing we all know, and likely the reason why we're listening in today, is that an all-electric future is here and now. The electric grid is only getting greener while natural gas is not. As electricity is getting cleaner, emissions from burning natural gas are becoming the majority of energy-related emissions from buildings. In fact, buildings account for nearly 40% of greenhouse gas emissions nationwide. And in California alone, energy use in buildings is responsible for a quarter of the state's climate pollution. Cutting these emissions requires an approach where gas-burning appliances like furnaces, boilers, water heaters, stoves, and clothes dryers are replaced with clean, high-efficient electric appliances that can run on 100% clean electricity. And the benefits of this approach in terms of safety, health, climate, resilience, and long-term cost savings are clear. And when discussing electrification in buildings, it's important to also narrow our focus to multifamily units and properties, especially those that are low income. An estimated 1/3 of Americans are renters, and if they are low income, they can end up paying about 4 times more of their income on energy than non-low income individuals. When we acknowledge that low-income communities bear a disproportionate share of climate burdens, this creates a motivation to ensure that electrification upgrades paired with clean energy are available equitably to all. Next slide, please. Because the most vulnerable communities, including those that are low income and communities of color, disproportionately suffer the effects of poor air quality and climate impacts compared to other communities, it is also important for these communities to be prioritized and supported in the transition to a clean energy future. Improving access to clean energy means lower utility bills, depending on the local gas and electric rates, for both property owners and residents. And lower utility bills for residents can improve their quality of life in a big way. Improving access to clean energy also means protection against rising energy costs and providing a cleaner, healthier environment for more low-income renters in the state. Additionally, the transition to a clean energy future can make properties more marketable and desirable and improve unit turnover. Unit turnover is expensive and time-consuming for property owners. Careful planning and investing in electrification and solar upgrades can save money and reduce turnover time. Next slide, please. Electrification alone in multifamily buildings contributes to a healthier air quality by eliminating the emissions associated with carbon-based fuels, leading to a cleaner and safer environment. With the transition to all electric, incorporating solar can offset the electric loads and support with a reduction in operating costs for property owners. Even with solar energy being one of the fastest growing clean energy sources for multifamily housing, and even after recognizing that low-income communities bear a higher share of climate burdens, historically, there have been challenges when pursuing solar for multifamily buildings. From a property owner's perspective, there's difficulty in financing a solar energy system when the benefits primarily go to the renters. However, solar is now more affordable than ever due to a few reasons. Solar incentives via clean energy rebate programs, such as the Solar on Multifamily Affordable Housing Program, or SOMA. Also tax credits, especially after the release of the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, and the fact that the cost of solar has substantially decreased in recent years, allowing multifamily affordable housing owners to see an even greater return on their investment. Next slide. Even with the common challenges faced when pursuing solar, this slide provides a glimpse into a success story that installing solar energy systems on multifamily housing can be beneficial for both affordable housing providers and their residents. The solar energy project highlighted here utilized SOMA incentives and was able to successfully deliver energy bill savings to the residents. This slide includes a quote from Tom Coleshaw, the CEO of Self-Help Enterprises, about their project. The quote is, "We are excited for our residents at Sand Creek Apartments who will be saving nearly $50 a month on their utility bills. This means more money in their pockets for other necessities such as groceries and transportation, and it's partnerships like these that make a real difference in people's standard of living." Next slide, please. Next, we're going to switch gears to cover a few topics on solar energy basics. Next slide. First, we're going to talk about a couple types of solar electric power systems. The first is grid connected. A grid connected solar energy system is directly connected to the building and to the electric utility grid. When a grid connected system is producing more power than the building is consuming, the excess can be sold back to the utility in the form of net metering. If there is a power outage, the electricity produced by the system cannot be used in the building. The vast majority of solar energy systems will be grid tied and can be complex in their own way, as shown through the diagram on the slide. While battery back systems are an option, which we'll look at next, they are in most cases a little bit more expensive and can add some complexity to a project. Next slide, please. So then now looking at grid-tied systems with battery backup, just as a high-level overview, a grid-tied solar energy system with battery backup is also connected to the utility grid, but a battery bank is installed in addition to the other system components. This battery backup enables the system to balance production and demand and protects against power outages. As you can see from the diagram on the slide, the inclusion of a battery significantly increases the complexity of the system. Next slide. With the development of different billing arrangements, buildings that generate electricity from a solar energy system can receive financial credits on their utility bills for the electricity that they add to the grid. One of those billing arrangements is net energy metering, or NEM. With NEM, the solar energy system is directly tied to an existing building meter. Understanding NEM is integral to understanding how grid-connected solar works. NEM is often referred to as running a meter backwards. For example, if a building has a solar energy system, it may generate more electricity than the building uses during daylight hours, and the electricity meter will run backwards to provide a credit towards the electric bill. Then at night or other times when the system is underproducing, electricity is pulled from the grid and the credits are used to offset the costs. Buildings are only billed for their net electricity use. NEM as a concept is fairly simple. Where it gets more complicated is when you start incorporating this with multifamily properties. Previously, if you wanted to provide solar benefits to your residents, you would essentially need to build each of them their own solar energy system and individually connect each system to each resident meter. Doing this would drive the cost way up to the point of the systems being virtually unjustifiable, and you'd likely end up with a system that is often very messy and very expensive. Luckily, an increasing number of states and utilities are allowing for a mechanism known as virtual net energy metering, or VNEM. VNEM relies on the same principle as NEM, but allows for a single solar energy system to offset multiple common area and resident meters. The monthly solar generation is divvied up out to the participating accounts by a predetermined percentage that are defined by the property owner. Using those percent allocations, the utility applies solar credits directly to the multiple account holders' utility bills. This means that individual residents can benefit from a single solar energy system without the increased cost and abundance of equipment. Next slide, please. Next, let's just take a quick look at the type of utility rates that are commonly found on utility bills. For multifamily residents, utility rates may include tiered rates and time of use rates. With a tiered rate structure, you begin each billing period at a tier 1 baseline rate, which has the lowest price per kilowatt hour. If you use more energy than the tier 1 baseline allocation, you move into tier 2 and the price per kilowatt hour increases. In a tiered rate plan, there are typically 2 to 4 tiers, where the top tiers are considered high usage tiers. Therefore, the more you use, the more you pay. The best way to keep energy costs low with a tiered rate plan is to limit your total energy consumption. With a time of use plan, the price per kilowatt hour changes depending on the time of day. Using electricity during off-peak times will have a lower price per kilowatt hour compared to using electricity during on-peak times. On-peak hours are usually set between 4 and 9 p.m., which is typically the time when everyone is home from work or school and active in their homes using the most electricity. The best way to keep energy costs low with a time of use rate is to shift high energy use consuming tasks outside of on-peak hours. Next slide, please. After a solar energy system is installed and operating with the utility rates can look different for both the common area and resident bills. Residents within a certain electric utility will remain on their existing utility rate. Examples of those utilities are PG&E, SCE, and a couple others. Residents within San Diego gas and electric utility territory will be switched from their existing utility rate to a time of use rate. If residents are switched to a time of use rate, they may opt out and switch back to a tiered rate plan. Common area accounts will be required to switch to a time of use rate. It is important to note that the time of use rates are getting more and more popular within California. Utilities are moving towards shifting everyone over to time of use rates. So going solar can help jumpstart that eventual shift. Slide. Next, we want to provide a few notes on solar and utility allowances. HUD published updated guidance this week for public housing authorities and other properties participating in HUD multifamily housing programs concerning financial benefits from participation in community solar energy programs or on-site solar facilities. Depending on how credits are delivered, it may impact whether a new utility allowance baseline analysis is needed. Additionally, clean energy programs may have their own restrictions in place to protect resident benefits. For example, HUD released a memo offering guidance for the SOMA program. Through this memo, solar credits allocated to residents under SOMA should be excluded when calculating utility allowances and should not be counted as income. Next slide, please. Next, to provide some insight on solar energy project costs, we wanted to share a few solar numbers with you. Currently, the average price per watt for a solar energy system can be anywhere between $3 to $4 a watt or more. Of course, the price is dependent on details like system size, equipment, mounting location, rooftop versus carport, and other factors. For reference, based on data from the SOMA program, for nearly completed and completed projects, the price per watt is averaging $3.75 per watt AC. Also, we included a table in the slide to show a few examples of solar energy system sizes and project costs. It is important to note these values are estimates and the cost will vary. Lastly, it may be helpful to understand the estimated production of a system, or vice versa, how large of a system may be needed based on a property's consumption. 1 kilowatt hour produces roughly 1,500 kilowatt hours. So for example, a 10 kilowatt system will produce approximately 15,000 kilowatt hours annually. And it looks like that note may be missing from the slide, so we can get that edited for when we release the slide deck out. But yes, next slide, please. When considering solar, there is a wide variety of financing models that may be pursued. A cash purchase option is when the customer owns the solar energy system outright. When purchasing the system, customers can either utilize cash, financing, or a combination of both. Additionally, when purchasing a system, the customer pays for the upfront costs of the system and takes responsibility of the solar system. Responsibilities can include general maintenance and repairs that are not covered by performance guarantees or warranties. It's important to note, though, that maintenance, even under a cash purchase option, can be subcontracted to a third party. This financing model allows for the maximization of energy bill savings because you're able to reap 100% of the benefits your system produces. Third-party ownership refers to a contract with a third-party contractor who agrees to purchase, own, and maintain the solar energy system on your property and provide you with the solar benefits at a reduced cost. This option may be most appropriate if you do not have sufficient capital to buy a system outright or have limited time to manage, operate, and maintain the system. There are several types of third-party ownership contracts. With a solar lease, you agree to pay a predictable monthly lease payment to a third-party owner in exchange for the solar credits that the solar system generates. Under a PPA, or power purchase agreement, you pay the third-party owner an amount per kilowatt hour for the energy the system generates, which is usually a lower rate than what the local utility charges for electricity. Also, there may be other types of third-party owned agreements that are specific to the contractors you're working with on your project. Lastly, with the updates to the ITC after the release of the Inflation Reduction Act, cash purchase systems should be more feasible. The updates allow for customers to receive the updates could allow for customers to receive up to 70% of the total solar energy system cost as a direct payment. And on top of that, nonprofit developers who previously could not take advantage of the ITC can now benefit from the updates. For third-party owned agreements, when third-party contractors are leveraging the ITC bonuses, the third-party agreement should be more lucrative in terms of potentially a lower PPA rate, for example. Next slide, please. The following provides a high-level financial analysis and ownership option comparison for a 132 kilowatt DC system that serves 38 residential units. First, we show an analysis for a cash purchase option where the 30% ITC is leveraged. The net out-of-pocket purchase cost is over $84,000 with this option. There's a payback period of roughly 6.5 years, or a little over 6.5. And the year 20 net cash flow for this option is over $540,000. For the same system, if we're looking at it from a third-party PPA agreement, the PPA rate that we're showing here is 13 cents per kilowatt hour, and the PPA rate has an escalation of 3.5% annually, which does sometimes occur in PPA options. And we also assume an electric rate escalation, since we do know electric rates always tend to go up historically. And that assumption is at a 2% rate. For this option, then, the year 20 net cash flow comes out to be over $85,000. So with any financial model, of course, there are pros and cons. Some of those center around having the upfront capital to move forward with the cash purchase, maximizing electric bill savings, also to consider operation and maintenance responsibility and cost involved with that. So there is a lot to consider when deciding which financial model might work best for your organization. Next slide, please. So what will happen now is we will pass it over to Emma Barker with Eden Housing to provide a case study about projects in their portfolio that paired electrification with solar energy.
Thanks, Stacy. Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Emma Barker. I'm an associate project developer with Eden Housing, and I'm going to be building off of what Stacy spoke about with a specific case study from our organization on a rehab and electrification project, which was 3 properties called Aspen Grove, Maple Gardens, and the Trees Apartments that also had a significant solar system added to the project. Next slide, please. So a little bit about Eden Housing to start. We are a nonprofit affordable housing developer with 55 years of experience. We build across California and are based in the Bay Area with offices as well in Sacramento and San Diego. And we do have a portfolio emissions reduction goal, which is part of the motivation behind some of these rehab projects where we are pursuing electrification and solar in addition. Next slide. A little bit about the history of solar at Eden. So Eden started installing solar thermal on a couple of projects all the way back in the 1970s. And currently we have about 35 solar thermal systems, though we are moving away from this as we seek to have all electric buildings in new construction and in rehabs, and incorporating more PV instead. We started adding PV during economic recovery between 2009 and 2012, at the time being funded by MASH, which was the Multifamily Affordable Solar Housing Program. And we now have PV on about 85 projects and about 15 projects in the pipeline with PV as well. We do solar both on new construction and rehabs. At some properties, and kind of our baseline target is to cover the common area load with PV, but increasingly with SOMA, we are offsetting tenant load as well. So in looking for projects, especially rehabs, that we want to potentially add solar to, we like to prioritize properties that are kind of in rough shape financially and would benefit the most with the decreased operating costs of having solar cover some of the electricity costs. And we also make sure to look that tenants' income qualify for SOMA, as that's a big funding source for us. We are not required, but we do try to put as much solar as we can on projects. And we want to select projects that are really set up for success with the physical building, the positioning of the roof, that there isn't too much shading, and that the roof is in good shape. On new construction, we are usually required to do at least some amount of solar per code, and the size of the system usually becomes a trade-off between the upfront costs and reducing operating costs and finding the right balance between those. And for both rehabs and new construction, funding and incentives really are key to getting us larger PV systems. Next slide, please. So a little bit about these properties. These are 3 properties located in Gilroy that we purchased from another developer. So we've owned them for a few years and are getting the chance to rehab them, funded by USDA RD loans and HCG CERNA, because this is farm worker housing. And so this is not a tax credit resyndication project. The buildings were built in the 1980s, and of the almost 200 tenants, several of them are actually original tenants. Which is a really interesting dynamic as well. And the projects are up to 80% AMI, but many of the households are between 30 and 50% AMI. These projects are currently being renovated as we speak. One of the projects, Maple Gardens, has completed and is getting solar installed. The others are still in process. Next slide, please. So in terms of the scope, this is a pretty significant rehab at all 3 of these properties, including exterior improvements, including repairing the siding, weather barriers, windows and trim, paint, etc. Also community spaces, and then pretty significant unit improvements. Some were pretty much a full gut. Others were getting upgraded as needed, but we were including, bathroom and kitchen upgrades, new floors, paint, lighting, etc. And next slide. We also chose to do full electrification at this project, which is really exciting. We converted the heating system, boilers, gas stoves, clothes dryers, everything to high efficiency electric appliances. Also, we were able through this to add air conditioning to all 3 of these sites, which didn't have it. And in Gilroy, that is really unpleasant experience to not have air conditioning. So that was huge for the residents. This was the first project that Eden piloted installing induction stoves, and that's been going over really well with residents at the project that is complete. And at one of the sites, we did need to do electric service upgrades in order to have the capacity to handle the full electrification. The other sites, we did not need to do that. All right, next slide, please. So in terms of solar, we had originally planned these projects prior to SOMA, and we're going to do a much smaller system that Eden would own. But eventually we decided to partner with Sunrun and do an SSA, or a solar services agreement, which is one of those third-party ownership options that Stacy was referring to earlier. Because we did that, we were able to do a larger system with tenant offsets and utilize SOMA as well as funding for that. The amazing thing about this SSA is it's a no-brainer for Eden. Basically, Sunrun installs the system for free. And so it didn't have any upfront costs for us. They are also in charge of the ongoing maintenance as well as the permitting of the system and responsible for its performance. And we just simply didn't have the funding to do a larger system that we would own ourselves at Eden. They also include a great tenant education component, and they handle the ongoing SOMA monitoring and application process. And beyond all of that, they actually paid Eden a developer fee, which is huge. So not only did this not cost the project any money to get solar on it, but it actually brought in some money on the project. And like the project that Stacy mentioned earlier from another developer, tenants will be receiving about $45 per month credit on their PG&E bill. So it's tenant savings. It reduces operating costs as well. And part of this is because we're able to do such a large system, we're actually going to be producing about 95% of the electricity that the site uses on site, which is huge and much larger than we were originally able to do. Next slide. So Sunrun is able to do this by leveraging SOMA and other financing, as Stacy mentioned. As I mentioned, there isn't any cost to the developer, the owner, or the tenants, and we actually got a developer fee. So the fee that we received was almost $50,000 for all 3 projects, and that's based on kilowatts generated. And the SSA 8 that we originally went into contract with Sunrun on was 2 cents per kilowatt hour, which was compared to the 20 cents per kilowatt hour that residents were paying now before the renovations and before the solar install. So that's about 10% of what they were paying before for the electricity produced on site. And recently the contract got amended and updated to be 0 cents per kilowatt hour for residents. So residents will be paying nothing for the vast majority of their electricity use as it's created on site. And this is because the system is sized to cover almost the entire electrical load. Okay, next slide. So to cover some lessons learned from the Aspen Maple Trees project, the biggest one is that you do not need to be an expert by any means as on the development side. Samantha Meyer, who is the developer of this project, was really passionate about it and really pushed for the full electrification and for the solar system, but didn't have that much technical knowledge about this. And because of technical assistance provided by the AEA, and Sunrun handling most of the install and the permitting of the system, we were able to do this with very little more than just developer will on our part. Number 2 is that there are lots of incentives, so you do not need a solar budget. As I described in this case study, Eden paid no money to install the solar and actually were able to bring in developer fee and money into the project at the beginning, which is a huge help. And I noticed that, over 60% of the respondents in the survey at the beginning of this presentation said that the upfront cost was a major barrier. So if you follow a path like this, you can completely avoid that upfront cost, which is really great as well. Number 3 is that programs can benefit both owners/operators and tenants. As you saw there, tenants are going to be spending almost no money on electricity for this project on their utility bill, which is huge. And that also lowers our operating costs on our side as the owner. So that is great for us as well. Number 4 is to size the PV system correctly, especially if you're electrifying. This can be really challenging to try to predetermine how much electricity is going to be required on a project that isn't currently all electric, and so it doesn't have that data. But it's really important to do that modeling at the beginning to make sure that you do have a properly sized system. And number 5, kind of circling back to number 1, is just strongly encouraging you all to take advantage of the amazing technical assistance that's out there. The AEA supported us and still is so much on these projects, and that is what has made them possible. So we really appreciate that. Next slide. I also wanted to share some larger lessons learned from Eden as an organization as a whole. One is that each site is unique. I mentioned this near the beginning, but just want to bring it up that making sure to pay attention to projects that have good solar potential, whether the roofs have any issues, whether there's shading that's going to prevent the solar panels from operating at their maximum capacity, is all very important. The second is checking the operation and the output, and making sure that they are performing as expected. In the past, we've had issues with PG&E not issuing credits for months after installation, and still having to try to sort that out on projects. We also once purchased a property from another developer that had a PV system installed, but the connection in the electrical room had never been connected, so it just wasn't doing anything. So that's really important in our third point here, which is don't set it and forget it. You should know how much you're expecting to generate and make sure that the performance is living up to that. And if not, troubleshoot what the issues are there. It's really expensive to forget about it. You need to actively be taking care of and monitoring them. If they're not, operating correctly, you're not going to be getting that financial benefit that you wanted. There have been all kinds of issues that we've run into with our solar. One issue was during a painting process, some of the panels got sprayed by paint, so you want to avoid that happening. We had pigeons move into one property and were nesting on the solar panels. So this is all just goes to show that it's very important to be paying attention after install and make sure everything's working properly. I would just circle back that the main takeaway from this portion is really that you don't have to know anything to make this happen, and you can actually not only save money in the long run, but not pay anything for install and actually make money in form of developer fee up front. So that's all for me. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks so much, Emma. It's always great to hear about the lovely work that your team is leading over at Eden. I think before I jump into the policies and some of the implementation strategies, I did want to see if you'd be able to share a little bit of insight on utility allowances for Maple Gardens. It looks like there was a question about whether or not the Aspen Maple property leveraged QAC and how that might have impacted utility allowances.
Yeah, I don't recall right at this moment on that particular project, but let me circle back and see if I can get an answer by the end of the session.
Great, thanks so much. But with that, I think we can round off our presentation with spending a little bit of time covering some policies and some incentives that are driving solar forward. So let's go ahead and kick it off. Next slide, please. So in terms of policies, there's been quite a few developments on both the state and federal side. So on the state side, I'll be providing a very high-level overview of the 2022 Energy Code, the California Public Utilities Commission Virtual Net Energy Metering, or VNEM decision, as well as a high-level look at changes that may be coming to the Solar and Multifamily Affordable Housing, or SOMA program via SB 355. And in terms of the federal side, I'll be recapping some of the information that was covered earlier in session 2 of our training series on the Inflation Reduction Act, specifically around the solar tax credit opportunities. So next slide. To go ahead and kick it off, I'm just going to be covering a little bit more about the 2022 Energy Code. So this new Energy Code rolled out in 2022, And it established new requirements for residential and non-residential buildings throughout the state. So I'm not going to be doing an entire deep dive on all of the changes and updates within the code, but I am just going to be focusing again on that high level solar aspect here. So starting as of January 1st of this year, solar PV is now required for all newly constructed buildings. The solar requirements do vary depending on the building's height. So any properties with 3 stories or less have to just install solar, while buildings with 4 stories or more do have to install both solar and battery storage. And essentially, sizing for both solar and the battery storage portion is determined by a formula that's outlined in the code, but thinking specifically of the solar side of it, that formula takes something called the solar access roof area into account, which essentially looks at the amount of available roof space on the property that doesn't have any major kind of obstructions or shading concerns. And there are some options for properties to qualify for exemptions here, but they do need to be able to demonstrate that the property either has a solar access roof area that's less than 3%, or the solar system size would be either less than 1.8 kilowatts for low-rise buildings or less than 4 kilowatts for high-rise buildings. So basically proving that the solar system would be, very, very small and not very helpful. Or if local code enforcement deems that it's not possible to adequately house a solar system on site, can also qualify for an exemption here. And I know this is a super high level look at that energy code, but I do have a really great resource that I've linked at the end that is honestly has been my cheat sheet for things related to solar and some of these changes. So I hope that that resource is helpful for you all as we send out the slides, hopefully by end of day today. And next slide. Moving on to the California Public Utility Commission's proposed decision on virtual net energy metering, or VNEM. I think a lot of folks were interested in this, and it's been a pretty hot button topic throughout the last few months. And I know one person in the audience did have a question about this, but NEM 3.0 was passed last December, and the decision went into effect as of April 15th of this year. What I want to specify is that the decision on multifamily virtual net energy metering and the net energy metering aggregate rates were actually postponed to, or due to the fact that multifamily findings were really underrepresented in the research and the discussions taking place. So in the last few months, there's been a lot of advocacy around how we're going to, set forth a plan that will protect low-income housing throughout the state. So with that delay, we are expecting the CPUC to be voting on this proposed decision, specifically around, what happens with VNEM on October 12th. And let's say if it is enacted, I think those changes would go live sometime in June or July of next year. But kind of looking at those proposed changes a little bit more specifically, there's been a lot of uproar about what was outlined originally because it essentially diminished the value of solar by slashing the export rate compensation. From studies, the VNEM rates will change, day to day, or depending on if it's a weekday or a weekend or time of the month. But the research has estimated that the proposed kind of updates to the rates drastically reduce the value of NEM credits via NEM 3.0 by 75%. So it's a pretty drastic cut there. And the partnership and other partners are currently in the process of advocating for the adoption of adders for low-income properties to help mitigate the impacts of that reduced export tariff. And we're also advocating for something called on-site netting. Folks may not be familiar with on-site netting. Sometimes it's called islanding as well. But for context, it's something that's currently not available to multifamily housing specifically, but it does exist for single family housing. So really what on-site netting allows properties to do is that, if let's say a multifamily building has a solar system on the roof, it would allow that property to directly use that energy generated from that solar system, and avoid having to import any energy from the grid to, keep the lights on for that property. What's currently happening in multifamily housing is that, let's say you do have that solar system, any energy that's generated currently is being sent to the grid, and then energy is being imported back in. So if the export rates are being slashed and the import rates are only continuing to rise, based on those utility increases, there's a really big problem there, and this is a really big equity issue. So we're hopeful, based on conversations that we've been having, we've tried to demonstrate the impact that these proposed changes and reducing that export rate will have on multifamily affordable housing and low-income Californians, throughout the state. So we're hopeful that we can get some of these things added in and supported. And if, based on our advocacy efforts, if this is to work successfully, we're hoping that this translates into also an easier time to integrate battery storage on site as well. Due to this kind of tariff incompatibility or the not allowing on-site netting, there's been some pretty big challenges with, smoothly integrating storage on multifamily properties. So we're very hopeful that not only that the advocacy would result in preserving some hopeful or some solar benefits, but also ensuring that battery storage does get a little bit easier to tap into. But we will, if you are interested in kind of staying up to date about the latest info about virtual net energy metering, I really recommend signing up for the partnerships newsletter. We will likely be doing some sort of blog or press release about the status and some of the changes that are to come. So I would really recommend signing up for a newsletter. Sorry for the shameless self promo there. Next slide, please. And in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, lots of folks have been really excited about the developments that keep rolling through and how the IRA has been helping to drive clean energy forward. And while there are a lot of measures rolling out, I did want to specifically own in on, again, the solar specific aspect, which is the updates to the solar investment tax credit, or the ITC. The ITC has been retroactively set to 30% as of January 1st of last year, and it's going to remain available until 2032. So this is a pretty big win for folks who aren't as familiar with the ITC. It was established years ago and originally designed to help support the development of solar projects, but eventually phase out completely. So every year it was scaled to drop a certain percentage. So having it back to 30% and remaining in place until 2032 is a huge win for us. And in addition to that 30% ITC baseline, there's a few other exciting updates that have also come through, which the first one is that there are now certain bonus adders that can be paired with that 30% tax credit baseline. And these previously did not exist. So there are a few different types of bonus adders that a solar project can qualify for. So there's a 10% bonus for a certain amount of domestic content in that solar project. There's a 10% bonus for properties that are located in energy communities, which are sort of areas that have been disproportionately affected by the fossil fuel industry. There's also a 10% low income communities bonus or tribal areas bonus. And there's also sort of a more limited pool or a bonus that folks can qualify for. And that's an additional 20% low income economics bonus. And that is, I believe, limited to 1.8 gigawatts of solar capacity year to year. So this is, again, a limited limited bonus that folks can apply for that does subscribe, but if there's kind of unreserved funds year to year, that does roll on to the remaining years. So all of this is to say, theoretically, an organization could get up to a 70% ITC, assuming that the project qualifies for all of the bonuses here listed on the slide, in addition to that 30% baseline. And the last thing I wanted to highlight here, in addition to those bonus adders, there's also a really interesting opportunity that kind of makes the ITC more accessible to nonprofit organizations or tax-exempt organizations, state and local entities, and tribes as well. There's something called direct pay, which creates the opportunity to receive a payment for the full value of the tax credits. Again, this was something that wasn't previously allowed. There was no pathway to claim the full value of the tax credit. So we're really excited to see how this direct pay option can help to benefit our nonprofit partners, or, if folks aren't choosing to do direct pay, how this also contributes to just reduced out-of-pocket costs for solar at large. But I did find a really great resource that is hosted on the White House page, and I've linked that again at the end of the presentation in our resource slide. And that is a great tool just to show how folks can go about requesting that direct pay option. And apologies again, there were tons of updates coming through from the IRA, but we did have an entire session on this about 2 weeks ago. So I have linked the direct recording link here on the slide, and I recommend, if folks are interested, to go ahead and check that out. But if there are any kind of questions about the solar related portions, I'm happy to answer a little bit more in the Q&A as well. Next slide. And again, there's tons of interest in the IRA, and we really understand that it can be quite complex to keep track of all the information, the updates, the timelines, and that overall this process might be difficult to navigate. So I just wanted to flag that this is really where our clean energy programs step in as a valuable resource, because they are actively working on sharing information and providing guidance on IRA related initiatives. So for example, programs like SOMA are already tailoring their TA services to demonstrate how rebates and the ITC can be stacked together. So this slide here does show a snippet of SOMA's solar preview report, which is essentially a tool that's designed to help prospective participants and applicants understand, the associated costs of potentially enrolling in SOMA and installing solar on their building. And, while that report is great, it now includes a table highlighting, how the ITC and relevant bonuses can actually be stacked up with the SOMA incentives. So this just goes to show the TA providers are again here to help. These reports are free and easy to access. So if there's any interest in getting a report that shows, what your ITC value could look like along with SOMA incentives, feel free to email me. My email is going to be at the end of the presentation, but I'm happy to go ahead and get a report started for you, just to, again, build transparency around costs and hopefully make this process a little bit easier. Next slide. And now that we've, spent tons of time covering solar today at a high level, I did want to mention that there are a few solar incentive rebate programs out there that can help offset project costs. So the 4 programs listed on the slide are all programs that my team over at the California Housing Partnership helped to implement. So we're happy to, do interest calls, portfolio reviews, or just help answer any general questions that you might have and just be a resource for you all. But starting with SOMA, or the Solar on Multifamily Affordable Housing Program, it is the largest statewide solar program out there. It's a successor program of the MASH program, which is now sunsetted. But currently, this program is only available to existing buildings. But I did want to share some news that there is currently legislation out there, SB 355, that is proposing a few program design changes when it comes to eligibility. So this bill is currently waiting to be signed. We are hopeful about the outcome of this, but I do believe that the governor has until midway through October to get this legislation signed and put into action. But some of the changes that are outlined in SB 355 include opening up the program to new construction, as well as allowing or increasing our income threshold. So properties that previously, may not have had low enough AMI thresholds to qualify may now qualify. And we're also hoping that there is a potential to allow master metered properties to participate as well. So again, we are still waiting for the final update as to whether or not this is going to get signed. But if it does, we are expecting these changes to roll out probably no earlier than midway through next year. There will have to be a few kind of efforts led with the CPUC to do some handbook changes and ironing out kind of how these changes look in practice. So it does have a little bit of a longer timeline for implementation, but we are really excited to potentially be expanding the program's reach. Additionally, beyond SOMA, there are a few other programs. There's the Low Income Weatherization Program and the Comprehensive Affordable Multifamily Retrofit Program. They're both very similar in the sense that they're whole building energy efficiency programs, but they both include optional solar pathways for properties that are interested in installing solar through the program. So there are incentives available. It does tend to be a little bit more limited when compared to SOMA. So we'd like to encourage some co-leveraging if possible, for example, through LIWIP and SOMA, but for those LADWP specific customers, we do have camera available. And lastly, for new construction, we do have our Building Initiative for Low Emissions Development, or the BUILD program, which incentivizes all electric new construction, and it does also offer incentives to help cover the cost of solar PV. It does only cover or offer incentives for any solar kind of extending beyond the required building code amount, but just wanted to flag that that still is available. And overall, these programs do typically cover anywhere from 50 to 80% of the total project costs of the solar costs. But, with additional help coming through from the IRA, we're hopeful that we can bring these costs down a little bit more. And certainly, there are situations where the solar systems are free, just depending on the system's design and ownership options and how big of an incentive you might receive from the program. So there could be the opportunity for a free system as well. And again, I'm not going to be covering these programs in too much detail, but I did want to highlight that our session next week is going to be 100% focused on helping to finance electrification and solar. So if you're interested in learning more about rebates that are out there, again, please make sure to sign up and join us next week. Next slide, please. And the one thing I really want to hit home here is that not only do these programs offer thousands of dollars in rebates to cover work that you're, likely already doing, they also offer this free comprehensive technical assistance that, Emma had mentioned earlier. It is really helpful, and the TA teams are really well equipped to, work with TA or developer teams of all experience levels. They can help with things like solar feasibility, project management support, and as I mentioned earlier, providing guidance on the IRA updates as they become available. So really, it's just another layer of support to make sure we're turning out successful projects at the end of the day. So please do not let this opportunity go to waste to get, free rebates and assistance as well. Next slide. So our last section here is just a few planning and implementation strategies. I'll try to move through this fairly quickly so we can have more time for our Q&A, but with that, I'll go ahead and jump in. So determining the timing for integrating, or pairing solar with electrification is really dependent on project specifics. It can vary across your portfolio. So I just wanted to provide a few examples in this slide and the next slide that show, some considerations or questions to ask yourself about your projects as you consider those timelines for pairing both technologies. So for example, if you're working on a major rehab development and your planned upgrades do include a roof replacement, it's probably going to be a little bit more cost effective to install solar panels during that roofing process. So you might want to start or install solar earlier rather than later. But also, I think Emma hit home on this earlier, is you're also going to want to make sure that, you're planning properly for what the timelines actually look like. So if you finish your electrification work, early and your solar work is delayed and that interconnection process is going to take, anywhere from 3 to 6 months to finish, you might have some excess out-of-pocket costs as you're, covering the cost of those electrification upgrades prior to that solar getting connected. So you're just going to want to think about how those timelines add up with each other. Next slide, please. And the last kind of consideration I wanted to highlight here is that, you're also going to want to think about any site constraints that your planned electrification work might cause. So best case scenario, your new construction development should be designed to avoid any major roof obstructions to, maximize the amount of solar roof space available. But it could be wise to have your electrification and design plans firmed up just to get a clearer picture of the available space and shading patterns. Next slide. And for kind of just the sake of time, I'm going to be skipping this slide and the next slide, but I just wanted to flag that I have included high-level checklists of steps that go into integrating both solar into new construction as well as existing buildings. So thinking about things like planning, contractor selection, kind of the tenant education piece, and the long-term monitoring and maintenance of the system. So feel free to look back on this as a resource as well. And then next slide. Thank you. And I won't be doing a deep dive because we have just been talking about solar here today, but I think I would be remiss if I didn't talk about battery storage at all. Battery storage is really important because it does allow the property to store that excess solar energy generated during the day for use during, those peak hours or at night when those time of use hours or time of use rates are higher. So it is a really important technology in just maintaining long-term affordability as well as building resilience. But there have been certainly challenges around actually integrating battery storage into multifamily housing at large. And some of those challenges really are around the limited funding available for multifamily affordable housing. I think the primary battery storage program is a self-generation incentive program, or SGIP, but the budgets that multifamily housing can tap into, the equity and the equity resilience budget, are often oversubscribed and it's very competitive. And of course, there's also issues with pairing SGIP with programs like SOMA due to those incompatible solar tariffs, or the incompatible tariffs around on-site netting. So, while battery storage is awesome and we want more of it, there are definitely hurdles that we need to address in order to fully actualizing this across, all of our developments. Next slide, please. And lastly, I just wanted to highlight that early and continuous engagement is super crucial in ensuring that you have a successful project. We really encourage your teams to collaborate closely with a range of stakeholders, including those program implementers. I feel like I sound like a broken record at this point, but please, please, please take advantage of, solar rebates that are out there and the free technical assistance that these programs offer. They're, again, here to provide support and act as liaisons between not only your internal teams, but your external contractors as well. So please take advantage of these incentives and technical assistance while you still can. They're extremely helpful, and I really recommend it. But with that, we are at the end of our presentation, at least the content portion. So we'll open it up to any questions that folks had. So let me go ahead and pop into our Q&A box. Let me see. So we have a question for Emma from Larry. And the question is, how is Eden Housing able to negotiate a developer fee for the solar projects with a third-party vendor? They haven't seen this happen before, so any insight on making this possible would be helpful.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Larry. I saw that. Would be curious what third-party vendors you've been working with. I know that Eden has specifically a history working with Sunrun, and that has been a part, having that developer fee has been a part of multiple contracts that we've held with them. So I'm not sure if maybe that's specific to Sunrun and maybe whoever you're working with does not do that. But I know that the opportunity exists out there with Sunrun and other developers. So definitely encourage exploring it.
Great, thanks so much, Emma. Looking at our questions, it looks like we had a question around signing up for that newsletter, and I saw my colleague Blanca drop the link into our chat. So hopefully folks were able to get access to that. And it looks like we have a question on whether these funding sources trigger prevailing wage requirements on projects. So I do believe, I'm not sure exactly what the timeline is, but I know thinking about SOMA, it's not currently required, but with the prevailing wage, there was an update where I can't remember what the threshold is, but projects or solar projects over a certain kilowatt size automatically triggered prevailing wage. So I'm wondering, Stacy, do you happen to have any further insight on that? If not, I think I can happily circle back with Ken via email.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea to circle back.
Awesome. So apologies, weren't able to answer your question, Ken, but I will be in contact with you to get that answer over to you. And then we had one last question. I'm not sure if maybe other folks have chimed in the chat, but we did have a question around whether or not any of the developers have experience installing solar or upgrading HVAC systems on existing properties before or after LIHTC resyndication. So Emma, I'm not sure if this is in your wheelhouse or if you've had an answer, but also if any attendees have thoughts on that, feel free to drop your thoughts in the chat.
Yeah, I personally have not actually worked on a rehab that was a LIHTC resyndication that also involved installing solar or those upgrades. So I can't speak to that personally, but I know our organization has, so I can also circle back on that and get some answers from others.
Great, thank you so much. And then we had one more question come in, and I see that Stacy's typing out an answer, but the question was, do different utility providers have different interconnection requirements, or are they largely the same? So Stacy, do you mind? Oh, I think you might have answered that already, so I'll pop into that. So it looks like Stacy's saying yes, for the most part, most of the interconnection requirements are similar, but there may be some nuances just depending on the utility provider in question. And then let's see, we have another question here. If you're not a tax credit project, can you get any federal rebates? I believe so. I haven't heard personally of restrictions on kind of limiting those rebates just to tax credit projects only. The ITC is available across the board, not just to multifamily affordable housing. So I have not personally heard of any restrictions on that. But it looks like that was our last question. So maybe we can go ahead and wrap up here for the day. I just wanted to take a moment and thank the audience for joining us, and to all of our partners who have helped make this training series possible. But most importantly, I also want to express my gratitude to our panelists, Stacy and Emma. I know I learned a lot today, and I hope that others did too. And please remember to take a moment to fill out our post-event survey and provide your feedback on what worked, what didn't work, and what topics you'd like to see in the future. And we hope to see you at our final session on financing next week. Thanks so much, everyone.